So without further ado, I want to welcome our panelists today, our presenters. First off, in the room with me, right across from me, we have Mahima Raghunath. She is the manager for both mobile and now web QA over at Cigna. How are you doing, Mahima?
I'm doing good, and I'm looking forward to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely glad you're here. And then also with us remotely, but still close to our hearts, we've got Paul Dumas, Director of API at shop.com. Paul, how's it going over there?
It's going well, and Paul, I appreciate you having me on the webinar with you today.
Yeah, and what I'd like to do is actually simplify the who's talking to who today, because we're both called Paul, and so most people usually call me Bruce one way or the other. So for today, anybody wants to call me something, call me Bruce. And I am the developer evangelist. I'm the developer evangelist over at Perfecto Mobile. So yeah, what I want to cover today are a couple of things. First off, obviously the report itself, why it succeeds, some of the methodology behind that, just some simple, just so people have some context. And then also, there's this term, digital experience, that I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about what that really means. And then we'll dive into the key findings and specifically 4 challenges and some of the recommendations behind those in delivering excellence. So we'll finish this up with a couple of takeaways and then do some Q&A at the end of the session, leave some time for that. So that context about the report. So what we did was we surveyed a bunch of people in April and May, so 2 months and a month ago of this year, and it was over 1,000 respondents. We got a really great return on the responses there, and this was all sorts of people. This was managers, there were a few C-levels, there were a number of QA folks. It was QA and dev heavy, so practitioners in the mix, and a few other people in and around the technology space, consultants and the like. And out of that data, we have some baseline demographics. Obviously, we asked a couple of questions like what's your role in the organization, industry, size of organization. These standard things that just give us an opportunity to segment the data and ask some questions based on other variables. And the specific questions in the survey itself were around the topics of a digital experience, how people are addressing that topic today, how enterprises are dealing with that. Also, questions around responsive web and the patterns and the teams and the practices around how you deal with responsive web. We also asked questions specific to automation. So dear to our hearts is the concept of automation, and we'll talk about that in a while. But that we find that being a real driver or an enabler to a lot of the higher patterns of how to restructure and provide vision and direction into how to release faster. So automation being a key thing for us. And then also we asked questions about the devices that you're using in testing and how you see those work as well. So as you can see, just by splitting it out, the demographics kind of show who we're talking about, some of the results. A significant portion of them came from both high tech and, of course, financial services. Those being obviously some of the hottest sectors for technology and products there. But then also what we saw was that about half of the folks who responded, they were also from large organizations, so on the much larger end. And there was representation from smaller organizations, but the dominating features here were the high tech and financial services and large enterprises. So, like I said, there's a term here, digital experiences, and I really want to lay that out, what we mean before we use that in today's webinar. In the report, we showed this, and this is a graph that describes the growth in each of the types of platforms that we see since 2013. Now, the thing is, this is not incredibly new. Everyone has a mobile phone now. Everyone uses a browser. So that's not the news here. What is the news? What's the new thing is that we are now seeing how impactful it is that we don't use them exclusively for any one task. In the report itself, it breaks out that information about like, what media is being used, what types of content is being used by which platform. And as consumers, right, we also expect that the voice of a brand is really the same and consistent regardless of what device we use. Amazon on a phone should be similar to Amazon on the website, similar to their engagement across email and so on and so forth. So really the fact here is, and this was, Mahima and I were talking about this, and is really now the normal state for these things. It's not just an or when it comes to how we experience things. There's multiple devices involved and it's an and situation, and mobile and web and so on and so forth. So that's really the taking point that I want to start with. And here's an example of a new digital experience. So this is a customer. His name is Finn. He really is on the hunt for a new TV. And so in the morning, he gets a little alert on his wearable, on his watch, and that's about a TV that he was looking at earlier. And so on his first break, he actually logs into the mobile app connected to that same sphere, and so he's looking at this and he's like, yeah, that's definitely what I want. So he puts it in his cart, but on the mobile app. And then later on that day, he actually has some time in front of a computer where he logs into the experience through a browser. And guess what? That's in his shopping cart. Now that's the same activity across multiple channels even before he goes and purchases. But once he does, once he's convinced, then he goes and he buys it online. So right after that, he gets a phone confirmation of his purchase. And that reassures him that not only was his decision accurate, but that something's coming along the way. So speaking of, the next morning, he gets another alert that the TV shipped. And then finally, and that's on his watch, and then also on his watch, once it actually arrives, he gets a notification. So within a matter of 2 days, he gets multiple communications from the same organization. And also, the fundamental thing here is that it's from his perspective. And that's what I want to hone in on here, which is the digital experience. It's about perceiving what the customer experiences. It's from the customer perspective. It might be over multiple devices and channels, and it's definitely related to the location that the person is in. So, for instance, you have to reach them where they are. And so that might vary based on certain times of day, when you're at work versus when you're in transit, or when you're waiting for your coffee or your tea. So this involves various levels of interaction. And so that's what it means to the customer. It's a very customer-centric view of how to come to market with a product or a service. On the flip side, though, it does mean different things for organizations going through this process. They have to adopt new technologies to be able to deliver this thing. Maybe wearables is one of them, but also software and tools behind that. Also, it demands more from all the teams. They have to be connected. They have to be working together in order to accomplish this thing. And then also, it means that you're delivering on multiple channels. So by channels, I don't just mean different devices or platforms. I also mean you're thinking about it in terms of, let's say, the emails that are coming out from sales and marketing. You're thinking about the engagement, the customer engagement from product teams or from inside the organization to provide feedback. And then also, it presents challenges on how we do business. So these things are different from what it means to the customer, but still, two sides of the same coin. People who are bringing things to the customer experience and the customers that are experiencing those engagements. And so beyond that, it's really important for us to understand how the classical thinking over channels, specifically how we deliver our organization's message, is different versus devices. So throughout the conversations we have with our customers, we also see that doing this successfully requires this unified strategy at a higher level. And I actually want to show a little depiction here that describes that journey to digital for these app teams. So this is varying degrees. Everybody has different size organizations, different team structures behind this. But if you've got a mobile initiative, that's the start where a lot of organizations are coming from. That might include mobile projects, but they're disconnected. You've got this sort of, it might be agile and waterfall mixed together. You don't have too much synergy at the business level. You don't have people working together at that business level. They're different projects. The second step is maybe you've got a new initiative like a DevOps initiative. You're optimizing the software lifecycle to shorten the feedback loop, and that's important. And this is where business synergy starts to come into play, where, yeah, you've got some teams that are working together, and you might have some cross projects, but more importantly, there's a better understanding of the customer's needs, and this is where digital really takes form. You might even go further than that and actually merge web and mobile strategies. Still, the teams might be separate because, and we'll talk about that later, but the concept of bringing something to market requires you to do both and collaborate on things like release cycles and feature sets and stuff. Still, it's lacking that connectionness between the language of quality, both from the technical aspect as well as the business. But business, this is where the business people start to really understand they've got something new and exciting, and that it can actually do some really great things for them, new revenue streams and so on and so forth. And then finally, way at the very end, and this is really in a very mature digital strategy, it's an entire paradigm shift to be able to shift to ship faster, as well as also be able to improve the experience not just for the customer, but for the organization that's delivering to the customer. There's shared key performance indicators, both at the business level as well as the engineering teams, and certainly even extending out to other folks like marketing and sales. And we all start to share this common concept of how to measure success across that customer engagement. And there's a common language for really evaluating quality of the apps that we bring to market, as well as the experiences and the risks when we start to ship things, and where we start to change dials on, do we ship faster, what do we do to improve that. So that's what I mean by a digital experience, and that's kind of how organizations, everyone from small teams or just starting on that journey all the way out to full, mature, or large-scale enterprises, whatever it is, we start to see this change, and we start to see these are some of the major milestones to that process. So let's dig into some of these key findings specifically on the report. Before we do, I actually want to start a poll, which is something that we asked in the survey itself, which was the question, what experience does your organization provide, specifically on platforms? Are they mobile and web apps? Are they only mobile apps? Or are you only doing a .com site or app? So if you want to go over to the poll that shows up on the left-hand side typically and gives your answers, that will give us an indication of what kind of experiences you're dealing with today with respect to what we found in the report. So Mahima, I just wonder, what's your guess as to how people are going to answer this question?
In this stage, I'm thinking people should have or will have less apps.
Yeah. Yeah, my guess too.
And it has to be both.
Yep. Paul, how about you?
I would expect it to predominantly be mobile and web.
Yeah. I mean, going without a mobile presence at this point is like going without a web presence 10, 15 years ago. So I would expect the same thing.
Yep.
And as we're seeing, we're getting over 50%. Still plenty. There's a few people who haven't answered as well, but the dominant shape of this is that, yeah, mobile and web apps really rule the game here. And that's what we saw in the report, was that a significant portion of those people are doing that. Now, also related to digital experience, right, we find that the people in the organization, when asked how important is it in your organization to deliver a reliable and consistent and engaging user experience across all those digital channels, a combined 80% of respondents said that it was a matter of survival or critical to their competitive positioning. This is really interesting because I'd expect leadership to understand this, people who are setting the vision, but I'm actually pleasantly surprised that so many people from all the various lines of business understand how important the competitive aspect of this is. Paul, you work in APIs, so your work spans across multiple channels. The data that flows out of that serves multiple experiences. How do you see the digital experience thinking, the thinking around that, really impact these business lines that your API serves? Do you feel that impact? You see a ripple effect of that customer experience?
Oh, that's absolutely one of the places where APIs really show their benefit, because all these separate channels can have one source where they get their data and their functions from, so that you can make sure that you're consistent across all the channels.
A big enabler, in other words, the data underneath, a big enabler to being able to do this sort of omni-channel approach to things. Also, the next thing, sorry, I'm just closing a window here. What we saw in the survey, was that a vast majority of people are doing mobile and web here, right? So not too many people just have a website or just have a mobile app. And what we also see from the report is that looking into that data further, we see that basically if you drill in, we see 80% of orgs and 50% of enterprises still have single teams for their web presence on both mobile and web browsers. So we're talking about potentially responsive websites serving both the mobile experience and the web experience. And there's a big difference in the way that small orgs versus enterprises. If I had to guess, I'd imagine that the web team's mobile testing strategy has considerable overlap, though, with their native mobile app, simply because that same website code base has to serve two entirely different platforms. We're talking all sorts of different conditions that go on a mobile app, on a mobile device versus a full browser experience. So there's got to be synchronization over things like design resources between those two different teams, as well as things like branding and even potentially release cycles as well. And Mahima, from your point of view, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages if there's one team for the mobile devices, one team for the browser desktop environments? How do you see those teams working together?
So, from my point of view, there are certain advantages of having a single team doing both mobile and portal, because they'll have a combined strategy, they'll have a funding that's funded for the whole program, consistent user experience, and traditionally what has happened is, the funding for web is always good, so mobile benefits out of it, and we can do a lot of automation. And but the challenges again will be, you don't get a focused attention on mobile, which is very important, because mobile is an emerging technology, web is already established. So for somebody from a web, they can just take off-the-shelf product and use it. But when it comes to mobile, it's a totally different mindset, and we have to start using different tools, it needs a lot of research to keep up with what's going on.
Yeah, and thinking in the future, towards the future, the same thing's going to happen, or is happening with these IoT devices that are starting to become part of the experience. Like I'm thinking Amazon Dash is a button, it's a sticker that's a button that allows you to order stuff right next to, let's say, your dishwasher. And so these kind of things being factored in, this is the testing strategies around those. As mobile gets more and more stable, just like web did, now all of a sudden we've got another emerging field that's doing that as well. So digging into a little bit of the data in the report further, one of the things that we asked was also, that question related to a couple of different lines of questioning, like, for instance, what conditions do you test against? We asked questions specific to their testing strategy, and what we got back was an aggregate of the fact that so many people consider this providing a reliable and consistent experience rather challenging. I mean, these are major challenges. And what I did was I looked at this and I said, well, wait a second, though. There's a 3% that doesn't say that there's a challenge. So I looked into that because I wanted to know if there were what the differences were like at that level. And some of the things that I narrowed in on were things like, well, how's your digital testing team structured? And of the people that said the unified team, for the unified team between the mobile and web, the mobile web and the desktop web, where that's a combined team, they said that there was no challenge. So there's a noticeable difference in the pattern there when there's a unified team. Then also, what conditions do you test against? And some of the things that they said, like for instance, those who found no challenge, they had no challenge doing background apps. But of the people who did find it a challenge, that was a higher rate. So the more elaborate testing you do, the more challenges you face. And this goes into what Mahim was just saying, was that, if I can summarize, it's mobile is hard. Mobile is harder than desktop in many cases. So, and then I split this up a little in terms of the size of the organization as well. And it seems that in some cases, there's more challenge when it comes to larger teams. And I wouldn't be surprised because you have to have the same shared skill set. There's collaboration that you have to do, coordination of efforts and resources. And the bigger your team is, generally the bigger the project, the bigger bite off the apple that they've already taken on existing projects. So sometimes being able to extend out to more elaborate testing or more elaborate experiences is not as feasible as just sticking with the testing that you know and the work that you already have to do. So going through some of this work, I want to go through the 4 challenges that we had in the report. We identified these major challenges that organizations typically face when delivering on digital experiences and really pushing for excellence in them. And so the first one is that, quite frankly, releasing new digital functionality faster is hard. It's tough. Growth. People are having a hard time keeping up with releasing functionality faster, And the software business never sleeps. We asked the question, how many product releases did you have, both for 2015 and what people estimate for 2016, what that'll look like for them. As you can see, from 21% in 2015 that release 13 or more times, so that's at 21%. Only 1 out of every 5 groups release more than essentially once a month. So that's interesting. But what's even more interesting is the expectation is growing, and it grew about 10 points, right? That's a 10-point difference that represents 50% year-over-year growth. So huge expectations on technical teams, considering all that goes into these mobile releases. I know some shops have tried to do the CD, the continuous delivery thing, and most enterprises we talk to are actually employing a lot of Agile, but they've had some problems going to full CD. I'm going to turn it actually over to Mahima here and ask the question. So, what have you seen in teams work in the past? Why are the expectations so high for releases?
Okay, so the expectations are certainly high, and with a mobile app, your quality drives the rating. Mm-hmm. So you want to put something out with the highest quality as possible. So to achieve that, what we do is we need continuous integration, continuous delivery. It's no longer a luxury. It's a fundamental expectation if you want to deliver a product with quality. And for that, it's easy. It's easier said than done. Yep. And there are multiple. We also struggled, and it takes years to perfect something. And with the right tools, training, it can be achieved. But it takes time.
Yeah. So that's interesting because I've heard this thing where people will say, well, if we release faster, we don't have time to do enough testing. And it sounds like it's actually the opposite, which is you need to be able to learn how to release faster in order to be able to maybe adjust for things along the way, rather than just, sliding back to that whole waterfall mentality or we'll release in long increments. I also know that mobile has some barriers when it comes to releasing, so it's not like you can just release this stuff without barriers. What does it look like from the mobile release process? Once you're done testing, what does that look like?
So, and again, right, when it comes to, mobile, we have to hit the market. Speed to market is very important.
Yeah.
And quality is also important. But then, like for Apple, you have to submit to Apple before at least 10 days.
Right.
Sometimes it's expedited. That is a luxury, but still our regression cycles, everything has to happen within maybe 10 days for a release.
Right.
But we have luxury with Android apps, so we'll have to work around that schedule. So Portal might get longer testing time, whereas mobile doesn't.
Yeah.
So hence, the automation, continuous integration, continuous delivery becomes even more important.
So there's that delay in the market, the marketplace, getting it out to the marketplace. And on the other hand, there are things that are coming in as well. Apple just shipped, in their developer conference, they've mentioned a whole bunch of new technologies, and just the speed to being able to address those. In your mobile app, I remember Facebook, there was an update to the iOS that caused the Facebook mobile app back when that was going on to now all of a sudden something that wasn't causing a problem would actually cause a major battery drain because it stayed active in the background. And so now something that was shipped as part of the platform has caused change to your app. So being able to respond to those immediately, you still run into that marketplace as well. And so being able to get used to releasing fast becomes a really good habit to have as a team, especially around the mobile space. Very interesting. There's a question that came in through the audience. What is the impact of localizing support on the success of an app, on localization? So when it comes to having to run multiple languages, do you run into any of that?
So our app supports around 15 different languages.
Yeah.
And, in US, it's a different English, different Spanish, but when you go to England, it's going to be a different US, so there's a US English and then there's a UK English.
Right.
So for that, we needed devices to be in different locations. We couldn't use devices that are US specific. So, and again, with Perfecto's help, we had some devices that are already in UK, so we, switched languages and it was easier for us.
Yeah.
So that was something that was very important for us to have devices in different locations for our testing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So the other thing that we see here is that if you want to go faster, there's a bunch of things you can do. But one of the most obvious things is to automate whatever you can. And then it becomes it's a must, right, if you want to deliver faster. And one of the things we asked, I mean, at first it seems like a dumb moment, right? Like, why not automate? But we were talking last night about some of the challenges there, and we've got a fragmented technology landscape, for even just within testing tools, not even talking about development tools. But we've got this fragmented landscape of, different tools and different technologies for different platforms, Android, iOS, you've got Selenium for mobile. And so that becomes really challenging to the process of getting everybody on the same page, and then ultimately about the technology, and then also further than that, getting everybody on the same page about the pace of delivery as well. Now, Paul, at a management level, where do you see the teams get stuck, maybe when they don't have the proper automation in place?
So, yeah, without automation, I don't see how people could even move forward, and especially when you're thinking about something like continuous delivery, because there's so much that has to happen so quickly, but at the same time, you don't want to sacrifice quality, and especially when, as you've already alluded to, in the mobile area, there's such an array of devices and operating systems and different deployment methods to the marketplaces that if a release becomes a big manual process, then you're going to just slug through them one after the other, and they're going to take forever. But the other thing that I've noticed, too, is when somebody does not have automated testing and their testing still manual, it's like, how often do you go clean up your email? It's the last thing you want to do, and so you wait to the very last minute. So what people do, what happens with teams that still do manual testing is it gets postponed to the end, and then you don't discover those bugs that you needed to spend more time on until it's almost too late. So there's that other problem of just procrastination when you don't automate.
Yeah, so there's two aspects of the automation. It gets you faster, but it's also really the only way to do things like regression testing within the cycle, or enough coverage and regression testing within the development cycle before you release.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And so what we see in the report is that, yeah, a lot of people are saying what they use as a strategy to improve the frequency of product releases is obviously more automation, and then more unit testing was interesting, because I know it's always a challenge to figure out where do you draw that line. What's a unit test? What should the developers be responsible for? What should where do they need help? Why are these tests that maybe they ship, they build these automated tests using things like Espresso or XC-Test? Why are they breaking on a regular basis? Why are they not more resilient throughout the further motions in the life cycle? But we also see things like testing on more devices in parallel. And obviously, anytime you can use parallelism, whether that's multiple teams working in parallel with each other, sharing responses in real time, whether when you've got a compressed time frame, you've got to do more in less time. You need to turn to parallelization on multiple levels, with people, with devices. I'm not surprised on that. And so the other thing is that is mobile testing really harder than web testing? I'm going to turn over to Mahima here as one of the experts there. And when we ask the question, what percentage of your mobile web team is done automatically versus manually, we saw that there was a little bit of a difference here in that mobile, we saw a lot of people basically say we really only cover about 10%, maybe 30% on the low ranges, and it petered out very quickly, as opposed to web. Now, you were talking about how the technologies around web are a little more established, a little easier, a little more prolific. I wouldn't be surprised that this trend has to do with that, but also the fundamental nature of these devices.
So it's also the mindset of the management, right? So far with web, it was, they have established tools, and then it's all about ROIs. But with mobile, you're not going to get a lot of ROIs because things keep changing so much. Like every patch, you have different OSs coming, different devices, different patches to the OS. So you have to run your regression, not just regression, but your test automation on every device, and you have very little time. And for that, it makes, so you're not going to get a lot of ROI. It's all about getting more coverage, speed to market.
Right.
That is the focus. But if the mindset is all about ROI and how much money am I saving, that strategy does not work in mobile, and that's the mind shift that has to happen.
Absolutely, going from trying to unsuccessfully attach the concept of ROI to testing, as opposed to saying testing really just enables us to release faster.
Exactly.
As a strategy itself, to make sure that we're not pushing more bugs downstream, which takes longer. If it's caught by a developer, it's going to take less time and resources to fix right in front of them. So that actually, the cost is a different argument than a return on investment thing.
And even for business, right, if the app rating goes down, there's nothing that can be done after the release.
Right.
And that costs more.
Right.
Because once your app ratings is down, it's very difficult to bring it back up.
Mm-hmm.
So aligning the IT team's testing vision with the business and explaining why it has to be done a certain way actually helps. That's how we did our strategy.
Yep. I did a similar alignment, sort of narrowing in on the web, because there's a couple of questions we asked around responsive web. Responsive web is a perfect example of where there had to be an alignment in how, in what we do in order to produce an experience that occurs properly on multiple devices. We went through many years where there was a separate website for the mobile thing and a separate website for the desktop experience in a browser. So having to manage two separate teams because of the technology is almost like putting the horse before the cart, in a sense. You're making decisions at the business level about how you address, especially in a digital experience. You're being forced to make those decisions based on the technology at hand rather than on how you want to engage a customer at a business strategy level. So I've got another live poll here, which is the question that we asked in the survey. And if you would all be so kind and answer your take on this, the question is your customer web experience a responsive app? And by responsive, we mean using the same code base for both web and mobile, the web app or website when experienced in a mobile browser versus in a desktop browser. So we'll give a few minutes for those answers to come through. And Paul, what do you think? What's the likely situation here?
We may have more of a split between the same code base for both desktop and mobile, and those separate versions. Because I think traditionally it's been separate, but now responsive seems to be a very popular way to go.
Yeah, we're tracking right with that right now. So far, we've got 20% say they use one responsive code base essentially. We use responsive app, works on both desktop and mobile browsers. We see it 17%. So there is a split between yes, it's responsive, and no, there are separate versions of the desktop app. Very interesting. The thing I want us to put out there, and this might actually spark up some conversation or some questions, some suggestions from the audience, is that some technology, quite frankly, just lends itself to faster delivery. Responsive websites are pretty straightforward in the sense that you can set them up on a virtual stack and get going. You don't need any necessarily any physical hardware other than what you can appropriate in a virtual machine, and it doesn't go through an app store. That's one of the big differences. So it's a bit easier to be able to release faster. And that's just how you get it out to market. But also the teams, what we saw in the survey here, was that of the people, when, going back to the release frequency, as it turns out, people that are 17 releases per year or more in 2015, a significant portion of them said that they are using responsive web. So this was something that stuck out to me to say, wait a minute, if you're able to release faster, does it have anything to do with the technology? So this is more of an open-ended question that I'd like the audience's input on throughout, moving forward, is do you feel like there are technology barriers to that faster delivery, or do you think it's more about the policy and process? So I'll just leave that as a question, as a curiosity. But the second challenge that we saw was that testing for real user environments, when we asked the question, what user conditions do you test against, was that a lot of people said that they do run apps in the background, which is good because that's a normal situation. Then also they do switch from 3G to 4G. They test for those conditions in the real world. And then also interruptions. Let me actually turn it over to Mahima. What do you focus on with your testing strategy? How do you know when it's appropriate to introduce greater realism? Like more of these conditions like dying batteries, or like, how do you make those decisions at the management level?
So it's usually what are we going to put out there? So let's say we had a functionality where we enabled users to upload a receipt. Mm-hmm. So take a picture, upload a receipt, and that took up a lot of memory from the device.
Oh wow!
So the more you do that, after a while you're not able to submit a receipt. So we understand that certain functionality is going to affect this. So you're taking a picture, and then maybe if there's another app also trying to use your camera. So technically, when we are talking about certain releases and what we are trying to do, we have a technical discussion with the team saying that, okay, what do you think this is going to, how is it going to affect our devices? So then that's when we start using our real user conditions.
Right.
And we use WinTunnel to generate different personas and test it out. So that keeps it easier for us.
Yep. And speaking with customers about how they use your app is always an interesting place to learn what you don't know. It's the what you don't know that really sometimes really bites you. And so doing your own exploratory can only go so far. Taking the app home, so to speak, but also incorporating real feedback and analytics from the field is important as well. The from the perspective of Perfecto, one of the things that we know is that you really need to identify your target persona. You need to know who's using your app and how they use it. We've got these really big cardboard, these graphics of each of the persona that we design apps as well as our platform for. And it helps us remember that it's very important to be in the shoes, in the mindset. Agile teams would know this by heart. It's a user story, who's involved, what it is, and why it's important. And specifically on personas, being able to integrate user traits into testing. Being able to do background apps. We've got plenty of background apps. I got probably at least more than a dozen running on my phone right now. That's a ready state. That's a steady state thing. And then interruption testing is not easy. You actually have to do that as part of your test. It can produce some challenges as well, but it's important if it's part of the real world. Like you said earlier, geography matters, not just for localization, but also if you have a problem that only occurs within a given network, like maybe an Orange network over in France or something, that you need to be able to simulate the devices from the region that is having the problem. And so geography really matters for multiple reasons. With teams, especially with teams that are necessarily separate, like a mobile app, a native mobile app versus maybe the mobile team on the web side, being able to share these reports between both QA and development as well becomes really important. We hear this a lot, is that being able to have shareable results to diagnose issues faster, and specifically visual validation of steps and what's going on the device really becomes a part of that process. So that transitions us to a concept that, one of the findings that we had is people are having a hard time staying up to date with the devices and the platform. And one of the things that Perfecto does is actually we ship something called test coverage, the index. And this is, if you see the link down below, if you want to grab a copy of that, there are challenges when you've got a lot of different devices with lots of different platforms. Those platforms may change pretty quickly, and they're from different vendors. Android's manufacturing release cycle is different from Apple's. There's operating system updates. And by the way, people accept those updates on their own time. You don't get to say when that is. So when they want it and when they need to. And all those updates affect you whether, whatever your release cycle is, it's outside of that process. So the migration process between those different platforms, even just version numbers, means that you as a team have to support multiple versions at the same time. That's just now a given. So being able to stay up to date with those devices and platforms becomes really important. That's why I suggest that that calendar of when things are planning on coming out becomes really useful for QA teams, even development teams, to know when are we going to have to deal with Apple updating things this year coming up. I think one of the taking points that we see in the report is that the visual validation really facilitates those interactions between QA and dev. A lot of people are using visual testing, and they're using those on devices, whether those are on-prem or whether they're in the cloud. One of the things that most apps, they require navigation. This is not just a login and press a button thing. You actually have to go through realistic workflows just to get to the functionality. So people are doing testing on the navigation itself, as well as the primary function that they're getting to. And then also I think one of the strategies that you should have is to consider, like we were talking about earlier, unit testing at the developer level is just one way to minimize the number of obvious bugs that could have been solved upstream down to test teams. And so being able to match the speed of the test execution, small developer unit tests work really fast, and that works in their in-cycle workflow. So in their IDE, they can run those unit tests as part of their build process locally. That's important because if a test takes way too long, it's not going to fit in that cycle. And then the longer running tests, like performance tests and full regression tests, of course, have to follow their own schedule and their own cycle in order to produce coverage that actually makes sure that moving forward, you actually do have coverage as well as speed to that process. So, the question is, and this is one of the things that we hinted out in the report, was the challenges that teams face when running in-house testing labs. So the question is, where do you really spend your time? But we've already kind of talked about that, is how do you, what do you do to figure out, where should you focus your testing strategy? Because you have to vary it. And so I think one of the things that we see is that obviously the biggest challenges, the ones that happen most often, like new browsers, new devices being released, that's where a lot of people spend their time. That's not surprising. But what I found a little bit interesting was that they don't have a dedicated team to manage the resources and update the lab quick enough, was an answer. It was 1 out of every 3 people said that the lab, just managing the lab is really problematic. And that's why Perfecto is in that game. So just a quick shout out to that part of the report. I would suggest taking a look at that as well. The last and final challenge that we saw was that people are having that hard time building a more efficient lab for mobile testing. So this is really close to the heart of what we do at Perfecto. And obviously, with any survey, we're interested to not just eat the exhaust of the industry and the marketing and that whole machine, but to really verify what are the particular problems that people are having. And this same data set confirms that the challenges that people are facing are coming from many different places. You've got QA in the middle, traditional QA. That's not all in one team. Oftentimes, those QA resources are spread across line of business teams, working directly with developers and with product teams there. But the challenges come from both outside the organization, like the marketplace, the updates, as well as the releasing faster. That's a challenge for traditional testing from internal resources as well. So external influences like hardware and framework updates, as well as internal teams who are really trying to speed it up. Doing a lot of this stuff, trying to maintain a mobile lab becomes really problematic for both of those resources. And that's why the continuous quality lab at Perfecto really comes into play with a lot of these organizations. So the thing here is, though, and if I can sort of round out this conversation, is that you really, your strategy over your digital experience and providing excellence over that has to address more than just a tools problem. It speaks to your organizational goals. If your organization isn't quite there yet when it comes to seeing the value of a full digital experience, that's going to happen quickly. The market is changing very rapidly, and the customer focus, I won't put it all on millennials, but the way that we interact with brands now has fundamentally changed. So the organizational goals are a part of that strategy, and will have to be fleshed out as well, but then also that impacts team structure. And Paul, one of the things we were talking about earlier was that really one should follow the other. Team structure doesn't dictate goals. It's that, your vision and your goals should flow down to how you structure your team.
Yeah, the strategy of the business and specifically the owner of the product and what he wants his digital experience to be and what channels he wants engagement in and what level of engagement he wants in each channel is really going to dictate or tell you where you need to focus the core of your team. I mean, do you really need a solid mobile team, because that's where you got critical engagement for your app, and you don't want it to be responsive. You want it to take advantage of different aspects of the devices. So that product strategy will, in almost 80 to 90%, almost tell you what your organization needs to look like. But then there's a lot of things that you can do internally and how you organize the teams to make sure that they stay coherent, while at the same time being able to focus on their particular tech stack and the way they have to release to their channels.
Right. We got to accommodate for variety between teams, but that testing process can help us unify the concept of what it means to have high-quality experiences across that whole customer experience and engagement.
Yeah, and one thing I might add real quick is, the notion of regression testing is to say that within an app, I may have only changed one component, but I'm going to regression test the whole app to make sure I didn't inadvertently disrupt something else within the app. So when you think about digital experience, if you're making a release just for one channel, maybe you just made a web update, you really should think about regression testing all the channels to make sure that you didn't inadvertently disrupt something for the digital experience.
Right. Or, at the very least, having some kind of strategy that ensures that that happens on a regular basis or as part of the process as well.
Right.
Yep. So, final takeaways. If you want one thing for the audience to remember, let's start with you, Mahima. So, you've been talking about it's now the new business as usual, right?
Yeah. So, I would say, so this was my takeaway, that change is the new business as usual, and change is the new business as usual for anyone in the digital solutions market. As such, your digital testing strategy must be adaptive, responsive, user-centric, and above all, agile to succeed in a dynamic landscape of technology.
Mm-hmm. And by agile, I'm not seeing a capital there, so I imagine that what you mean is something more like it's got to be nimble and ready to respond, mm-hmm. right? And iterative. Yeah, very cool. And Paul, your takeaway?
Yeah, as we alluded to before, the business and engineering teams are very intimate now, especially when we talk about digital experience. While the product person may know exactly where they want to go or what channels they want to be in, that engineering team needs to be consulting on what's happening in each one of those channels. And the technical engineers you're going to have are obviously going to be distinct in their practices, but your SDLC, especially at the beginning of it where you design and at the end of it when you test, is where you make sure those tech teams collaborate and still perform as one team.
Yep, absolutely. And from my perspective, it really is that digital experiences mean more than just testing a single application or platform. To your point, Paul, is that you really should maybe think about how, if there's, in a digital strategy, each of those devices, each of those platforms, and each of those touch points on the customer represents a critical opportunity. So if one of those are missing, it's like the weakest chain in the link sometimes. The whole chain breaks. So you want to make sure that you're testing not just for the individual components along that customer experience, but that you do have a certain amount of coverage that covers the entire experience, what you know your customers are doing. And this really requires quality to be built in to the very mindset of the teams and the business leaders that are executing on these things, that are building these and bringing them to market. It has to be baked in, and you'll hear a lot about building software quality into the development cycle, but it's more than just a development cycle. That's just one layer. It's the business strategy as well. So being able to make sure that teams have a way to not only agree that quality is important, but also have visibility on each of those metrics, and actually have metrics behind that as well. We see that a lot of people do have the metrics, but don't always align them to each other. So that becomes really important to be built in to the whole shared organizational approach to customer experiences. So with that, I want to turn over to a couple of questions that we have, and I also want to encourage you, before the webinar ends, to plug this in, bit.ly/whyappssucceed, and that gets you a copy of our report here. But I'm just looking across some of the questions we have, and let's see, we've got, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, it's Jen Jen, maybe. The question is, what is the best tools for testing cross websites and mobile apps? Well, that's a very good question to start with, and a bit loaded question. I guess it depends on the skills and the team. Open source is pretty good, but it does need to have support in order to fit into an enterprise. So it's one thing to deal with one person on a team or one team in a group of a large organization. We talked, there's a question here about the localization that we addressed earlier. Decisions to go web technology based on mobile versus native mobile development. That's a good point. So the full question is, does some of the stuff we're talking about influence decisions to go with web technology based mobile development? Things like Cordova, and I imagine we're also talking, that was PhoneGap, so it's Cordova and Bionic and stuff like that, versus native development. So very interesting, native development. It really depends on, I guess, Paul and Mahima, it must depend on some of the stuff that you're doing at the hardware level. If you don't need to.
Yeah, it's more of what app you're supporting. Like say our mobile app, if it is just doing what the portal needs to, you're showing some ID cards and claims, then probably you don't need a native app per se. But then if you're doing a health and wellness app,
yep,
then it makes sense to use a native app because you're using a lot of things that only a native app can track,
yep,
like biometric, stats, etc., etc.
Yep. So we've come up to the hour, and there's one more question that I think is worth it. So John asks, DevOps you mentioned DevOps before. Is that hard because everyone wants to use different tools? How can we fix this? Okay, good question. From my perspective, it's less about tools and more about the attitude, right? And seeing what needs to change and having visibility across those things as business owners. So while we mentioned fragmented tool chains earlier, while that can hinder automation, I think what needs to happen is that if it's not going to be all in one go. Being able to pilot how successful a DevOps motion is at a very small level, just peel off one team, try to do that more than one time, so that you can use that as an internal case study as well. That becomes really important as well. So I'll do one more question from the group. Just one more. Let's see. Doing mobile testing manually. Joe asks, we're currently doing all of our mobile testing manually. We're looking to move into automated testing for our mobile apps. We aren't really sure what the first best steps are. What would you suggest?
Okay, so if you're going to just start automation, I would look at the new technologies that's out there. So when we started from purely manual to mobile, we wanted to have a robust framework which sits on top of Perfecto because we are using the Perfecto devices and because it was very crucial for us to use real devices. So the technology, we had looked at UFT as well as Selenium, and we did a lot of pros and cons on using which supports what. And we stuck with Selenium as a technology because we wanted parallel execution across like 24 devices, and if it was sequential, it bumped up our testing timelines.
Yeah.
So it's a lot to do with the technology that you're using and picking the right open source tool. The open source tool also, you'll have to do some research on what are the open source tools that you have a lot of support on, because that Selenium has a lot of support even though it's an open source tool. So do a lot of analysis before you dive into automation is what I would say.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, at that point, we really do appreciate our panelists being here. Paul, thank you so much for being part of this.
You're welcome.
And definitely Mahima, we're welcome. We're looking forward to having you anytime you want to talk. And then thank you out there in the metaverse for being part of this presentation and for providing us some feedback, and keep it coming. We want to know what works, what doesn't. Check out the survey after the webinar and let us know your thoughts. Thanks, folks.